Welcome. This video provides an overview of preliminary damage assessments for FEMA Individual Assistance. We will cover some key topics, including what are FEMA's individual assistance programs, why are preliminary damage assessments or PDAs important for individual assessments, who completes PDAs for individual assistance, how are they conducted, what are the individual assistance declaration factors, and where can I learn more? First, we'll provide an overview of FEMA Individual Assistance. FEMA Individual Assistance, or IA, programs provide financial and direct assistance to disaster survivors with disaster-caused unmet needs. Support may include assistance for temporary housing and housing repairs, critical disaster-related expenses, replacing essential personal property, and funding to state, tribal nation, and territory governments for individual assistance program services. FEMA Individual Assistance includes three major categories of supplementary disaster funding. Housing assistance can support disaster survivors by providing money for rental assistance, access to temporary housing, reimbursement for emergency lodging expenses, and more. Other needs assistance provides disaster survivors with money for expenses like childcare and replacing personal property or vehicles damaged by the disaster. FEMA can also help connect disaster survivors to other federal or non-federal resources, both locally and nationwide. There are a few considerations for individual assistance eligibility. First, individual and households program assistance is not a substitute for insurance. It cannot compensate for all losses caused by a disaster. Its purpose is to meet basic needs and supplement disaster recovery efforts. Second, FEMA assistance may be provided when the disaster has caused damage that makes the home unsafe and not possible to stay in. The Individuals and Households Program Assistance is one of FEMA's most widely used forms of supplementary disaster assistance. It provides important support for things like repairing or replacing damaged or destroyed homes after a disaster. To improve efficiency, FEMA has established 4 categories of damage that an impacted home may fall within: affected, minor, major, or destroyed. Third, FEMA also requires that disaster-damaged components were working and in use prior to the disaster. Finally, the types of programs available to disaster survivors depend on the assistance requested by the jurisdiction where the disaster took place. To learn more about individual assistance programs and eligibility, refer to FEMA's Individual Assistance webpage on FEMA.gov. Now that we've discussed what individual assistance is and important considerations, let's learn more about conducting individual assistance joint preliminary damage assessments, or PDAs. State, tribal nation, or territorial governments are responsible for working with local emergency managers to assess whether initial damage assessment information is complete and aligned with FEMA PDA standards. They also manage the PDA planning process, review damage identified during initial damage assessments, and decide whether they should request a joint PDA from their FEMA regional office. After the joint PDA is complete, the governor will decide whether to request a presidential disaster declaration. Tribal nations can take on different roles, depending on how they choose to request disaster assistance from FEMA. They also conduct initial damage assessments and may participate in the joint PDA. For more information about the flexible options for tribal nations, reference FEMA's Tribal Declarations Guidance. Local emergency managers are responsible for gathering information about the location, ownership, occupancy, and insurance coverage of impacted residents and categorizing damage. They must use initial damage assessments to collect data and submit it to their state, tribal nation, or territorial government officials. FEMA regional offices coordinate with state, tribal nation, and territorial officials to conduct joint PDAs. The FEMA PDA coordinator reports to the FEMA Regional Recovery Division Director, often through the Regional Individual Assistance branch chief. After the joint PDA, FEMA regional officials recommend to FEMA headquarters whether a major disaster should be declared by the president based on declaration factors. Representatives from all of these groups form the joint PDA team. Representatives from other federal agencies, such as the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, Small Business Administration, and Environmental Protection Agency, may also be part of the joint PDA team, alongside subject matter experts such as engineers. The team visits impacted communities and works together to validate damages identified during initial damage assessments. Now that we know who completes individual assistance joint PDAs, let's learn how they are conducted. Prior to a joint PDA, local, tribal nation, or territorial governments conduct the initial damage assessment and identify damage. Their jurisdictional leadership review the initial damage assessment and decide whether to request a joint PDA with FEMA. If they decide to request the joint PDA, the governor or tribal nation chief executive will submit a request to the FEMA regional office using the PDA request template. The state, tribal nation, or territory and FEMA will conduct the joint PDA if the request is granted. FEMA and the state, tribal nation, or territory will develop a joint PDA plan of action and choose a methodology to validate damage and address program-specific reporting requirements. Once the joint PDA is complete, the state, tribal nation, or territory requests a presidential disaster declaration and submits the request to the FEMA regional administrator. The FEMA regional administrator reviews the requests and submits their recommendations to FEMA headquarters, who submits the recommendations to the president. The president approves either fully, in part, or denies the request for a major disaster declaration. If the jurisdiction seeks to appeal the president's decision, states and territories must submit an appeal within 30 days of the date on the denial letter. Tribal nations must submit appeals within 60 days. FEMA considers 6 declaration factors when evaluating a request for the IA program for states and territories, and 9 factors for tribal governments. The 6 declaration factors for individual assistance are listed here on your screen. The principal factors FEMA will consider include the estimated cost of assistance for uninsured homes and personal property losses, and the resource capability and capacity of the requesting government. For more detail on each of these factors, reference the FEMA PDA Guide and the FEMA Individual Assistance Program and Policy Guide. For tribal nations requesting their disaster declarations, FEMA considers 9 additional factors listed here on your screen. To consider these factors, FEMA requires an assessment of home and personal property losses and an impact statement that includes an analysis of available resources and other variables. For more detail on these factors, refer to FEMA's Tribal Declarations Interim Guidance. There are several considerations that you should keep in mind. First, joint PDA teams make every effort to capture disaster-related damage, including the data points listed here on your screen. Second, to set up the joint PDA process for success, local emergency managers and tribal nations should use these data points to guide their initial damage assessments. FEMA's individual assistance websites provide useful program and policy guides, templates, and resources to support preliminary damage assessments for individual assistance programs. Resources include training, checklists, fact sheets, and policy updates. For further details regarding the preliminary damage assessment, reference the FEMA PDA guide. Thank you for watching. Please reach out to the listed email with questions or comments.